Welcome to Resourceful Humans. I am your host, Corey Haber, and today I have Bill and Dina with me. I'm very excited to hear from them. They both have their masters in HR, and I know a lot of people go through that process of, should I get my masters in HR? Why should I do this? Should I just get certified and not get my masters? So they're here to tell us what are the pros and cons and what are the benefits and how can it help your career. So thank you for coming on, you guys. I'm very excited to have you. And
it's great to be here.
Thank you.
I'm glad you came. And go ahead, tell us, why do you feel someone should get their master's? Why should they consider that?
Dina, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Okay, well, I just can speak from my own experience. And I'm someone who was already in the HR field. So, I think Bill and I talked about, there may be someone who is just starting their HR career as someone in our audience, and also those who already have experience but want to advance their profession. So I was in the second category. And what really motivated me was I wanted to grow in my career. I wanted to grow financially. I also, knew a lot of practical, tactical HR skills, but really wanted to learn the theoretical of organizational design and learning. And, I was also on an executive team. So part of it for me was credibility. A lot of my team had their MBAs and their masters. And so I decided to get my master's at NYU as an executive and a business partner with an expertise in HR.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I also got my master's degree fairly late in my career. I've been working in HR for actually a couple of decades. I was thinking, how do I take things to the next step? Plus, I was also thinking, how could I potentially transition my career to teaching? Which ultimately I did, because I teach graduate and undergraduate students HR and NYIT. Plus, I teach the SHRM certification course there as well. So I think there were a couple of different motivations for me, like you, Dina, that kind of propelled me to go to graduate school. But I also have a lot of students who are starting out in their careers and they're thinking, sort of what's the benefit for me as somebody starting my career and getting a master's degree? I think for a lot of those students, it's partially credibility. Partially, I think they're thinking about, how do I come up to speed quickly in terms of some of the key HR functions like staffing, compensation, organization development, and so on. And I think for a lot of people starting their careers, that investment, learning about the functions as well as HR strategy, is a big motivation.
I have a question for the two of you. Do you feel like the benefit of having a master's in HR depends on the area of HR that a person chooses to focus on? Or do you feel like there are benefits no matter which area they focus on?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll say, going back to saying, being a true business partner, that's really the most valuable thing that I received from getting my degree. And so what I think that does is, it expands you're working as an HR leader, you're working cross-functionally with all teams, with marketing, with finance, with sales. And most of the degree, I went to NYU. We talked about the program at NYIT where Bill teaches, and you're not learning how to process payroll. You're learning how people, engagement, motivation, learning, and compensation strategy and benefit strategy enhances the business. So I think that's the most valuable thing. And what that does is gives you a lot more opportunity to pivot in your career. And the last thing I'll say is, and Bill, you may speak more on this, is that there are a lot more specific areas now. You can be a, diversity and inclusion director. You could be a director of learning. You can be a wellness coordinator now. There's a lot of different opportunities. So getting a degree just helps expand your knowledge of all areas of the business.
Right. Yeah. One of the topics we discussed the other day, Dina, was sort of the expectations of HR, right? You talked about being a business partner, but even people who are functional specialists in training and compensation and benefits really need to understand what the business is about.
Right.
So whether you're a business partner or a chief HR officer or a functional specialist, part of the traditional knock on HR people is we don't really understand the business. So part of the job of a good master's program should always be understanding or helping students understand, how does this business make money? What kind of competition exists outside of our business? Because quite frankly, whether you're a functional specialist or a business partner, if you really can't answer those questions and incorporate those issues in terms of your proposals, your work every day, you're not going to be very useful to the business. And typically the business will treat you accordingly.
What do you find, Bill, that your students are finding most valuable in the program? Or what are they getting that maybe they didn't expect?
I think they're getting education in things like finance.
That's why we go into HR, because we don't like math.
Yeah, just like we were discussing previously. Right. A lot of HR people say, I want to go in HR because I don't want to have to deal with numbers. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? Because HR people really need to understand, what is that market share? What about the issue of big data? How do people analytics help us to be more effective in things like engagement, productivity, etc.? And so I think master's programs, good ones that focus on business issues, help our students to understand these things, and students find these things to be valuable. Also, I think good master's programs, as you were saying, also help students understand strategy and sort of this longer term perspective, this sort of 2 to 3 year perspective of what is the business going to be doing? Because as I tell my students, this is a hyper-competitive environment. Your competitors are not only looking for your market share, they're also often actively looking to put you out of business. So HR people need to have some appreciation for that.
And I know, so we've been talking about all of the positives of, getting a master's, and, there's a lot of other alternatives, but I know the number one question for people is probably like, I know for me, it was like, oh, I can't afford it, or I have a full-time job, how can I ever make the time to do that? I can answer that question for me personally, but do you want to speak on that a bit for how some of your students, or in your own experience, like how you dealt with the cost issue and the time commitment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a really big issue for students, because there's really two costs. First, there's the cost of the tuition, whatever that might be, but there's also the opportunity cost, right? So some students go full-time, so they don't work, or potentially they're working part-time, or taking a job that is potentially below their experience level, just so it's more 9 to 5 focused and they can study and go to class. So there's two kinds of costs. So I think when students are considering sort of these two types of costs, they also have to think about what is the value proposition from the school I want to attend, right? How is this school going to help me achieve my goals for knowledge, for experience, for a future career? Do they help me find internships? Do they help me find jobs when I'm about to graduate? To what extent do they help me also network,
Mhm.
not just necessarily with employers, although that's clearly important, but also with fellow students?
We
So,
talked about that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Working was something that also, influenced my decision, but I didn't even realize how valuable it would be. Again, not to get a job but just the colleagues that I have now. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, right before this podcast, I was on a call with someone who was a student with me, and she's head of HR for a big agency, and we knowledge share. We have a support system. There's so many people that you can go to for their resources, because a lot of the challenges I think we deal with, I know for me, it's not in a textbook, and it's really good to run by other professionals and any instructors and professors that you're still in touch with, just to kind of like roll things off them and get gut check.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think a lot of people who graduate find it useful, stay in touch with people they attended classes with. They also find it useful to talk to their professors. Typically, a lot of my students approach me and say, you know what, I'm really not happy with job X, or I just got fired or laid off. So help me find other positions. So good programs that are well networked help students as well as their graduates to do so.
And do you do that, or do your other colleagues do that? Do you spend time with your students outside of class and once they've graduated? And
Sure. Yeah, so I think these days, as all three of us know, it's all about networking, right?
Yes.
And so establishing that network and maintaining it is really pretty critical. A couple of my former students are currently on the Leadership Council of New York City SHRM. We have a couple of alums who are on the board of SHRM Long Island. Plus, we've got several alums who are in senior HR positions. One of them used to be the chairman of the board of SHRM National, actually.
Wow.
So our students do really well, but the core of that is the educational experience, plus the networking and the types of experiences that we give our students while they're going to class. What other additions do you have, Dina?
in terms of
Sort of the value proposition for graduate students.
Yeah, well, we were talking about that. I think, like I said, I'm repeating myself, but the one that was most valuable was understanding this language of business. And it reminded me, though, I want to come back to it because I'm currently the head of people at Bandier. We're a fashion retailer. And my chief marketing officer shared with me a page from the book Powerful, the Netflix book by Patty McCord. And she shared with me this, oh, what's that?
Oh, I said, okay, I'm familiar.
Yeah. So she shared with me this, but I want to read it because, I was so proud to say to her, oh, 100%, like this is me. She said, one thing I absolutely advise is making sure your HR people are your partners. You must stress to them that you want them to be true business building partners. Do they know your 3 key drivers of revenue? Do they know who your top 4 competitors are? Do they know about the technology that's about to disrupt the market? Tell them. And if they don't want to know, replace them. And I think the value of this degree was learning that that's who I am. Like, that's who we are. We're business partners. Again, if we're functional specialists or generalists, that it's no longer personnel, and we're not just filling out forms and doing tactical jobs. That all organizations right now are competing on talent. It's not the industrial age. We all have the same computers and the same technology and the same platforms. It's really people who are really our, that's what makes the difference with our customers and in our business. So that is something I'd reiterate as being the most valuable. But that being said, the network was great. And having most recently been job searching during the pandemic, I was surprised to see that a lot of postings said, degree required, master's preferred. There's quite a few jobs that actually, articulated that's what they're looking for. And what that says to me is they're looking for people who have a broad experience and understand the business of the language.
I've had a lot of people that I personally know just through LinkedIn or just in general that I work with that are having that issue. They don't have a master's in HR, and that's required for most of these positions now, or it's preferred, I should say, it's preferred. So yeah, it makes it difficult.
And it also gives you experience just like your undergrad does.
Right.
I'm not working in my undergrad degree was in television production, but I learned much more than television production, and in grad school it was the same way. And Bill, you and I talked about this, about the teamwork, like the projects that in my program at NYU, so many of them were revolved around team projects. And just that alone, it just teaches you, how to, effectively interact. And we both had in common who was always the team leader. I was. Bill.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And so how do you delegate, or how do you, it's just how do you, even in a classroom setting, you're dealing with people who might not be meeting expectations or being responsible. So that was also really, really valuable to experience. And of course, all the writing and presentation. It only makes you stronger in those very basic skills that you need in business.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's another factor though. Some of our listeners may be thinking, all right, Bill and Dina, this is all great stuff, but what about the bottom line? What kind of difference does the degree make in terms of compensation? So a couple of pieces of data. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which basically is all about the data, right? So they're projecting that over the next 10 years, the number of increase of HR jobs in just this region, New York City, Long Island, New Jersey, the number of jobs is going to increase by almost 15,000.
Wow.
Plus they expect between turnover and what have you, total openings to be roughly 20,000.
Wow.
So also New York City, New Jersey, Long Island ranks in the top 5 areas for compensation for HR people. Mm-hmm. So guess if companies are going to have these openings, if they're going to pay that much money, guess what they're going to be looking for? A lot of them are going to be looking for graduate degrees, because graduate degrees not only mean expertise and network, they also mean commitment. Because somebody who's going to pay those opportunity costs and tuition costs are also committed to their profession, which is critical for employers.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk about that because that was, like I said, could have potentially been a real barrier for me, especially going to a private university like NYU. And a couple of tips I have, one is if you're going to school for your profession, in most cases, for me, it was tax deductible, my tuition, a lot of my books and my costs. So what I did was when I got that nice refund, I put it right back towards the tuition. So I put half of it on a loan, which I'm paying off, but didn't have 100% of it on a student loan. The other thing is a lot of companies have tuition reimbursement programs. The company I was working for at the time didn't, so I made one. And it was great because it was then a great benefit for the entire company. But my boss was like, yeah, if you want us to do this, put the program together. And so if your company doesn't have one and you're in a position to not maybe create it yourself, but talk to your HR team to suggest it, I mean, it's a great benefit for a company. So those help financially too.
Yeah, I agree. Also, SHRM also does scholarships. They're competitive scholarships, but actually the SHRM Foundation does a really good job of funding, people who show promise, are committed to their careers. Also, sometimes organizations will have scholarships or funding for people who have done volunteer work as well. And sometimes schools like mine will also give scholarships to smaller degrees for people who had really high GPAs as undergraduates. Good.
Go ahead.
Why don't we talk, one of the popular topics that comes up these days, and we discussed the other day, Dina, was micro-credentials as well as certification. So people will sometimes say, well, 9N certifications are the new degree. Micro-credentials beat out any degree. So Dina, what's your opinion about this?
Well, I did do some research, and in fact, I think SHRM had at the time, this was in 2014, they had a workshop on should you get a graduate degree or a credential. And and this was before, now like Google has these micro credentials. You could go online with SHRM and get credentials, but they really laid it out. And to your point about commitment, the deciding factor for me and some of my colleagues who went was one, just the personal enrichment of the entire experience of going to graduate school, but also the level of commitment. So I think those are great supplements. And in fact, for me, I did get my SHRM certification after my degree because I had some time on my hands when I lost my job. And it's a good thing to do when you have extra time is study. And then, and so like, do you want to talk about, because I know NYU has a certification program that's a condensed version, but again, what I really got out of it was the commitment, the team building, the network building, the getting to know my instructors and professors. I go back as a guest lecturer for one of my professors' presentation classes. So I don't know if you get that through a certification program, but you can speak more to that.
Yeah. So don't get me wrong. I think micro certifications are great. And also I want to mention that by the time this podcast appears, New York City SHRM is going to be introducing 2 SHRM micro-credentials, which are really great. They're going to be taught by top-notch professionals who are leaders of New York City SHRM. Ingrid Thorpe is going to do micro-credential on inclusion in the workplace. Joel Peterson is going to do something on HR Department of One. These are going to be top-notch micro certifications, micro credentials. Really, really good. But they're very, very targeted. So if I've got a student just started a job as the HR Department of One. She's already said to me, I'm going to sign up for this program. She should. But she also has a master's degree and she also has certification. So I think targeted micro-credentials work really well when you've got a knowledge gap, which is specific.
Absolutely.
Certification, like you, Dina, I actually got certified for the first time. During a summer when I was going to graduate school, we didn't have classes. So I thought, why not? let me go for the SPHR's credential.
Are we nerds?
We are definitely nerds, right? So I think these certifications are good in terms of exposing people to really broad perspectives, but often the knowledge is a little bit sort of shallow. Not that that's bad, but it's sort of these days with SHRM credentials, looking at competencies, there's also behavioral element, which is great. But I think with a master's degree, there's a much deeper perspective of topics we discussed already, like strategy, staffing, talent development, etc. Because a master's degree really indicates you've gone through an educational process which focuses on deeper critical thinking, multiple sources of knowledge, schools are accredited, so there's a deepness to sort of, plus discussion skills, presentation skills, etc., that we've already talked about. So those kinds of things, I think, are really important for the longer term. The value of certification usually is shorter term. Usually there's an increase in promotions and in raises first couple of years after certification. But a master's degree, I think, lasts people their whole career.
And I would also add, you're exactly right. And when you brought that up, you know, I realized I've changed industries a couple of times. So for example, when I was in the hospitality industry, it was a lot more focused on compliance and wage and hour laws for hourly employees and tipped employees. Whereas when I moved to the creative field and we had mostly non-exempt employees, it was more culture and behavioral focus. So a really good way to adapt and be able to, you know, when you're changing industries is to look at a credential, to your point, that's more specific and has more of a target of what you need in a job that perhaps you don't have experience in, or just to make you more of an expert because, for example, in hospitality, you need to be an expert in compliance. Yeah, it's a good supplement too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing we said we were going to discuss was a couple of new trends in terms of master's programs. Do you want to kick it off, Dina?
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of them, and let me think about that. Oh, I think, you know, from my perspective, one of the things that, and we didn't talk about this, but now that we're in a remote workforce, that there's a lot of focus on that. So, I mean, it sounds strange to say it's a trend, but it will be, because I think a lot of companies have seen that it works. You know, I think a lot of companies were afraid, and now that we've been forced to do it, they see how productive employees are and how happy employees are if they have, you know, more time, less commuting. So I think that's an interesting trend. And I think for HR, you have to understand, how do you change the way you do everything, almost like performance management? How do you change how engagement works in your company, teamwork, collaboration? You have to be really creative in that area. I think that's something that right now is a big trend.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think another trend has to do with programs increasingly becoming cohorts. So instead of random groups of people starting programs at different times, taking different classes, that's potentially very useful for people as well. But increasingly, schools are starting to say, you know, maybe instead of having people coming and going, we get more benefit through networking, teamwork, etc., by having a cohort.
And you
where a group of people, sorry.
You were in a cohort, right?
Yeah, actually for both of my graduate programs, I attended as a member of a cohort. So you get all the benefits of networking, strong teamwork, which can be really challenging at times, as we discussed, but Once you graduate, that network is always with you.
Mhm.
Plus, it teaches you how to solve challenges and problems working with other people that you see on a regular basis and who also potentially can affect your success as a student. One of my graduate programs, the comprehensive exam was based on teamwork. So we had to do group presentations, we had group projects to do, and basically if we screwed up as a team, we all failed.
Right.
Despite the fact that one person may have done better than the others, we would all fail. That's a really tough thing, but it's great preparation for HR
And
because quite frankly, the success of HR really depends on other people. Dina, sorry.
right, right. No, I agree 100%. It's very applicable to the real world. Yeah. You
And
don't
Yeah.
do something. Oh, go ahead, Corey.
I was just going to say, I think recognizing that these virtual classes are an option now is very important, because I do feel like the number of HR professionals that are considering an HR master's right now is much higher, because they are able to work from home. And it does make things a little bit easier as far as doing online courses, because you are at home and you can maybe have some time between what you're doing at work to get some of this coursework done. So I have noticed that a
Yeah.
lot of HR professionals that I know have started to consider this route even late into their careers because of the change in their environment.
I'm
Mhm.
old school, and I, had an undergrad and it was fine. But then I went back, however many years later, and I thought, I'm going to do it differently this time. And I'm sitting in the front row and I'm raising my hand. And I did that. But again, this was in 2014, 2015, my academic advisor said, you need to take some online classes. And I was a little hesitant, but I did. And first of all, who knew, that I'd have to, 6 years later, know everything about Zoom. And, back then, it was a little intimidating, but
Right.
it was such a great experience. I learned just as much. There was nothing that was lacking in terms of the education, that class and what I took away from it. Several of the classes I did online. So I think that's really important. And I think it goes back to the time factor. If people are concerned about time, like you said, Corey, I would work all day and I'd have a 6 o'clock class, but I wouldn't have to commute. So I would just work right up until then, take it into a conference room, do my 3-hour class, and then order some dinner and, work a little more and go home. And that was manageable.
Right.
Yeah, I think taking online classes, especially through Zoom, is a great way to save time and be efficient and basically get it all done. The other trend, just starting to see this, is several schools are starting to say, there are a lot of people out there that are certified, or a lot of people who want to become certified, plus they want their master's degree. How can we package this up? So based on what I've studied, there's about 7 schools currently where a school will say, if you take your certification prep concurrent with your master's degree, we will give you credit for that. Plus, a kind of an emerging trend also is people who are certified before they start their master's. Some schools are starting to say, well, you know what? We'll give you credit transfer for your certification. So we're talking about that value proposition earlier. That's something to also look at. What will a school do to help me not only get the master's, help me network, but also help me get certified?
Mm-hmm.
I agree. So one question that I was thinking of while you guys were chatting is, I think for just for myself, I'd be curious too. Do you feel like there's a right order to do it? Get your master's and then get your certification. Get certification then master's. Does it really even matter? Or should you do them both at the same time? Because let's say someone doesn't have either. What should be their next step? What do you feel?
Go ahead, Bill.
Dina, go ahead.
I can only share, my own experience. I don't know that it's best, but it worked for me. And look, there's also the question, like before the journey of before making the actual decision to go to school to get my master's, I joined SHRM and I got really involved with SHRM. I took a couple of classes at NYU to just like check it out. I took a Foundations of HR and a recruiting class. So, I think everyone has their own journey. But for me, I felt because I was already working in the field at a senior level, that maybe I get a certification, maybe not, but I really wanted that graduate degree, like I said, because I was working on an executive team and I really felt, personally for myself, I wanted to invest in that. I deserved it, but also for my professional growth and financial growth and, to have that credibility. What do you think, Bill?
I think there's no one size fits all, right? I think if I'm 2 years in my career, I'm thinking, I'm really unappreciated around here, just not making progress. Potentially certification is great short-term mechanism, kind of jumpstarts your career. But if you're 2 years in and thinking, you know what, I've got long-term goals. I really want to be successful in my career. So I want to make that commitment. A master's probably is going to be the place to start. And potentially you can get your certification potentially during your master's or right after it.
I wouldn't suggest doing it during.
Yeah, if you can, definitely do it.
Yeah, but I will say too, the advantage of the certification too.
You said you would suggest doing it during or not suggest?
I would not suggest doing it while you're in school. At least for me,
But a lot of my students do this.
Really? Okay.
They don't sleep for 3 months, but they get their certification.
Yeah, if you're working full time, then maybe not. If you're not, that could happen. But it was a lot of studying and quite stressful. But look, the other thing about the certification, I don't just get to say, oh, now I have it. I have to keep it current. So I've always been someone that's gone to SHRM events and other events and conferences, but it forces you to do that, which I think is also a commitment, in some sense. Like maybe it's not a graduate degree that you spend all this money on, but it does force you to stay current, stay active, stay engaged in your own professional growth.
Yeah, I agree. I think probably the best scenario is have both. Get both as soon as you can, because for companies that are spending lots of money on top-notch HR people, they're going to say, well, we're going to go for the cream of the crop, and that is people with a master's and people with certification.
Right, that's true. Well, honestly, I learned so much too, even after we've already spoken about this before. So this was great, and I really think it's going to help a lot of people that are in this limbo of whether they should do it or whether they shouldn't. And this timing really, it couldn't be more perfect. I think they're remote. There's virtual classes that are an option, and it can only excel your career. So thank you so much to both of you. And if anyone has anything else they want to speak to about, they can definitely leave comments on the post, and you guys will definitely be involved in responding there too. So thank you, and love to have you back again.
Great, that'd be terrific.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Great talking to you.
Thanks.